Can I start, Karen? Okay. Welcome, everybody. This afternoon, at least Belgian time, this afternoon. It's different, of course, in other places in the world. At this webinar about China and the WTO, why multilateralism still matters. And of course, a special welcome to Petros Mavroidis and André Sapir. I will give the floor first to Carrie Ottoburn so that she can introduce the webinar series. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you've joined us before, welcome back. I think we have several familiar faces among the attendees today. We are kicking off our fall season for the Globe webinar series of the Future of Global Governance. And I am very happy that we're joined by Professor Bart Kerremans today, who will be serving as chair for today's session. And we also have Professor Petros Mavroidis, as Professor Kerremans has mentioned, and Professor André Sapir, who will be discussing their recent book, China and the WTO and Multilateralism Still Matters. Bart, our chair, is full professor of international political economy and American politics at the Leuven Institute for International and European Studies at KU Leuven. His research focuses on the political economy of trade and environmental policymaking, particularly in the context of the World Trade Organization and with a focus on the United States and the European Union. In just a few moments, I'll pass the floor back to Bart to introduce our speakers, who will then present their book, and after which we will have some time for questions from the audience. So do send questions to us throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box or the webinar Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar window. You should see a little Q&A. If you use that, you can send the questions directly through there. And we will collect those questions throughout the webinar, and we will share with the speakers following the presentation. So please use that feature. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as to look ahead to 2030 and 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they will need to deal with future challenges. And finally, quickly, if you enjoyed today's episode, I would like to inform you all in advance that our webinar series will continue throughout the fall. And with our next one on the 17th of October with Anne-Marie Clark, we'll discuss her new book, Demands of Justice, the Recreation of a Global Human Rights Practice. So I invite you to check out the rest of our fall lineup at globe-project.eu. And now I'm very pleased to pass the mic back over to Professor Bart Kerremans. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carrie, for this introduction. I would like to start first by introducing the 2 speakers today, the co-authors of the book on China and the WTO. Start with Petros Mavroidis. I'm going to do it in English, Petros, not in Dutch, even if you understand it. But anyhow, he's an Edwin Parker Professor of Foreign and Comparative Law at Columbia Law School. Previously, he served as a member of the World Trade Organization Legal Affairs Division, and this from 1992 to 1995, and has been a legal advisor to the WTO since 1996. He was the chief co-rapporteur for the American Law Institute study Principles of International Trade, the WTO, and in 2017 he was awarded the Certificate of Merit of International Law from the American Society of International Law for the first 2 volumes of his book, The Regulation of International Trade. Petros Mavroidis combines a unique expertise as an insider in the WTO with that of a legal academic scholar. And I'm quoting Jose Alvarez from the New York University School of Law here, namely that Mavroidis prides himself as a practical academic as opposed to a pie-in-the-sky academic. I don't know what I am, but anyhow, it's certainly very interesting kind of combination, this practical expertise and the role as an academic scholar. And a similar kind of combination of that inside experience with scholarly expertise can be found with the second co-author of today, André Sapir, on our second guest. Professor Sapir is professor of economics at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, He's a senior fellow at the Bruegel Institute and is a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. Between 1990 and 2004, he worked for the European Commission, first as economic advisor to the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs, and then as principal economic advisor to Commission President Prodi, also heading his economic advisory group. In 2004, he published An Agenda for a Growing Europe, a report to the President of the Commission by a group of independent experts that is known as the Sapir report. After leaving the Commission, he served as external member of President Barroso's Economic Advisory Group and as a member of the General Board and chair of the Advisory Scientific Committee of the European Systemic Risk Board based at European Central Bank in Frankfurt. Welcome to the two authors of the book China and the WTO, Why Multilateralism Still Matters, a book published last year with the Princeton University Press. China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 was rightly hailed as a huge step forward in international cooperation, but also as a potential challenge for international cooperation. However, China's participation in the WTO has been anything but smooth, with China alienating some of its trading partners, particularly the United States. The mismatch between the WTO framework and China's economic model has undermined the WTO's ability to mitigate tensions arising from China's size and rapid growth. What needs to be changed? China and the WTO demonstrate that unilateral pressure by the United States and others is probably not the answer. Instead, Petros Mavroidis and André Sapir show that if the WTO enacts judicious reforms, it could induce China's cooperation, leading to renewed confidence in the WTO system overall. They develop their argument based on in-depth discussion of current contentious issues. I look really forward to their presentation and the discussion that will follow. So I'm happy to give the floor to Petros and to André.
Thank you. Bedankt voor de uitnodiging, Bart. Ik ben erg blij om hier te zijn. Ik spreek heel Engels, hè? So we'll do it for the benefit of everyone. So this is the book that André, in large part, and me, in smaller part, co-authored together. And these are the questions we ask in this book. First, what is the issue with China's participation in the WTO? Second, why the current responses, unilateral, all of them, haven't worked. And then we ask the question, how can multilateral responses help? So our responses are the trading nations essentially complain about the role of the Chinese state in the Chinese economy. And more particularly, there are two preeminent complaints, the role of Chinese state-owned enterprises and transfer of technology. There are other complaints of lesser value. These are the two complaints that routinely you will see both in the docket of the WTO and in the economic press. Unilateral actions so far have proven counterproductive, and the multilateral actions so far have not helped much because, in our view, litigation can be of marginal help. So what we would like to see happening in the years to come is an amended WTO, which could take care of some of the concerns because some of the concerns are legitimate and improve the monitoring of compliance. Now that's the outline of the presentation. We divided it, André and myself, into 4 parts. I'll be doing a brief introduction in every part, and then André, I'll pass the floor every time to André. And we'll go through the 4 parts within 20 minutes, more or less. The first point will be, does China observe WTO obligations and is it enough? And here our response, as I'll show you, is it does, but it's not enough because the law itself cannot adequately take care of the China issues. Then, of course, we ask the natural sequential question, why is the law inadequate? Were the WTO incumbents caught unawares? Did they miscalculate China? And to some extent, there is some truth in the argument that there was optimism about China's transformation. There are also political economy explanations, We'll go through this in part 2. Then we'll ask the question, what can be done now? And we'll discuss our proposal against the background of existing attempts to address the China issue. And finally, a few words on, are we headed in the right direction, and the reasons why André and myself are not very optimistic about what immediately follows. So let's start with the first question. Does China observe its WTO obligations, and to what extent it is enough? Now, of course, to respond to this question, we need to know what are China's obligations, no? In short, and we don't need to spend too much time on this, but we can during the Q&A session, China must observe the WTO, which binds everybody, and the protocol of accession, which is China specific. Now, the WTO is a trade contract. It does not address the role of the state per se in the national economy, other than through disciplines on subsidies and state trading enterprise. Why the WTO did not do more, we'll explain in 2 seconds. Now, subsidies are sanctioned, but the key issue is who is the subsidizing entity. If state-owned enterprises are considered public bodies, then everything they do is a subsidy. And if not, it's not. And that's part of the acrimony, or a large part of the acrimony between China and the rest of the world. State trading enterprises that are meaningful intent, what should we do? But in practice, the appellate body managed to turn the testing to its head. And anyway, this is not the prime concern with respect to China. Now, the protocol of accession, where many people put a lot of hope, did not request from China to reform, because it cannot request from China to reform. You cannot, in a trade contract, impose disciplines which have nothing to do with international trade. So the protocol of accession is some sort of a little bit of wishful thinking. I understand that China, you are trying to change over time, fine. There are a few improvements on existing WTO obligation, but there is nothing like, here is a blueprint on how China will transform into a market economy. Now, why doesn't WTO do more with respect to the role of the state? Well, the WTO did not come from nowhere. It's the successor of the GATT. And if you go back in time, the GATT was negotiated by market economies. They took it for granted that the domestic economy would be a market economy with state intervention, of course. The whole idea behind the GATT in FDR's mind was what John Ruggie and Karl Polanyi later described as embedded liberalism. We start with a market, we have state intervention to the extent we want to address at the time issues concerning unemployment, but these are not centrally planned economies. And there is unanimity. I mean, no matter whether you read the chief economist of the GATT, Jan Tungler, or historians like Zeiler, or economists like Doug Irwin, the liberal understanding of the GATT permeates the GATT contract. Moreover, state-owned enterprises were not discussed at all, A, because they were infrequent, and B, because they were disciplined by domestic antitrust. These were market economies. They were taking care of this type of problems. Now, as membership became heterogeneous, things changed. But heterogeneity in itself made substantive amendments very onerous. It's one thing to discuss the role of SOEs between the US, Canada, and the European Union. It's a different thing to discuss SOEs between the European Union, Russia, and China. More on this later. Now, with this in mind, now that we know what China has to observe, has China observed its obligations? Now, what exactly observe means, it's a very long discussion. So we can take as proxy implementation of adverse rulings. Now, why is this a reliable proxy? Because the WTO, unlike any other international contract, embeds compulsory third-party adjudication. If I don't like what you do, I take you to the court and you cannot stop me from going to the court. Now we counted with André all disputes where China was respondent, 47 number. US, almost in half of them was complainant, EU, a little bit less, 9 cases. There is only one case where the implementation has been in doubt. So overall, you cannot say China did not behave well. Now, there are some caveats. Baum and Keynes, they have an excellent paper where they say, well, we don't all discuss systemic issues. We discuss maybe narrow trade interests. Maybe so, but that's not China's fault. They also say the contract is under-enforced. I mean, if you, especially if you take trade shares as a proxy, yes, we should have seen more cases against China. But again, I mean, you cannot blame China for not litigating more. So with this in mind, it's difficult to say that China has not been a good WTO citizen if you accept our proxy. Furthermore, for reasons that will become apparent as we progress in our discussion, there is a disjoint between the subject matter of litigation and the concerns voiced. There are only 2 cases concerning SOEs. And actually, in both cases, China complains, not the rest of the world. And there is only 1 case of transfer of technology. And this is the observation that, if you wish, made André and me think in terms of legislative amendment and why it is necessary. There is not much you can do against those things within the existing legal framework. This is the lesson, our main takeaway when we discuss dispute adjudication against China. Now, of course, there are cases where China has won. It shouldn't have won in our view, of course, for whatever our view is worth. Litigation hasn't helped. This is more or less the conclusion we have for the first part. Not much you can do concerning state-owned enterprises. We'll explain why in a moment. Nothing you can do against transfer of technology. Why nothing? Well, because transfer of technology, the concern voice has to do with requests by Chinese private companies to transfer technology. Foreigners should transfer technology in order to access the Chinese market. Because FDI in China is often conditional upon joint ventures with a Chinese company. There are exceptions, the woofers, wholly owned foreign enterprises, but these are exceptions. Now, Chinese company refuses, that's the classic scenario here, refuses to enter into a joint venture absent transfer of technology. What can you do about it? The only thing you can do about it in the WTO is if you manage to attribute the no to the Chinese state. But that's a very cumbersome test. If you do not go over this hurdle, you can do nothing in the WTO, because the WTO does not sanction private behavior. It sanctions only state behavior. This table is the last point of the first part of our discussion and sums up how the way we see the world. When it comes to addressing China's exports, we have very strong disciplines, and this is not where the problem is. We can address Chinese dump their exports through anti-dumping, subsidized through subsidies. Of course, we don't know how much we can address because there's a problem with to what extent are SOEs public bodies or not. We can impose safeguards, special safeguards. But the big problem is, how do we open up China's market? This is where the role of the state becomes the impediment to penetration, and this is the major source of the acrimony, if you wish, of Western states when they discuss China's problems. And I stop here and I pass it to my dear friend André.
Not much to add, Petros. At least to me, it was extremely clear. Maybe one or two words. I mean, you addressed, in a sense, throughout this first part, sometime explicitly, sometime implicitly, the notion of market economy. And indeed, number one, we know that, contrary to the situation in the European Union, and we are going to have this discussion soon with the potential negotiation with for the accession of of Ukraine, we do have a market economy test, right? You need to be a market economy to enter into the EU, to join, and we have a test. There is no such test, obviously, in the context of the WTO. But not only there is no test of a market economy, I think the evidence is largely that China is a market economy, but simply because there are many varieties of market economies. We have different market economies within the EU. The EU is a different kind of market economy than the US. And, you know, we in the Union, we call ourselves a social market economy, so a particular variety of market economy with an important role of the state. And China calls itself, and always did, even prior to accession, and claimed that that's what it was striving to become, a socialist market economy. Socialist they already were, but they were striving to be a socialist market economy. And it's this issue of, you know, what does it mean? How does a socialist market economy, this particular variety of market economy, what, you know, it's like a particular variety of capitalism, sort of state capitalism. How does that fit with the WTO? And that's what I think we come to see at the end of this first part, is that there is a problem, there is a gap between the WTO philosophy, understanding, what we call liberal understanding, and the China model. So something needs to give here. Back to you, Petros.
Excellent. So why do we observe the picture we observe? I mean, where, and that's the question we ask, where the WTO incumbents caught unawares. Now, of course, André and me were in a very comfortable position because we wrote the book in 2021. We were not present. I mean, we have different knowledge now about China than people had in 96, 7, 8, 9 when they were negotiating China's accession. We are a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacks. Now, one thing that, and we spent a lot of time in the book discussing the historical part, because both André and me believe there is a value in studying history and the lessons you can learn concerning this type of questions especially. Now, in one sentence, and that's what this part suggests, the GATT managed to absorb small statist economies without a problem. Hungary, Poland. We made some adjustments. We said you'll have quantitative targets, but we didn't change the GATT. And there were not an issue for the GATT members, none of them. You never heard complaints about them. You heard complaints about Japan, lots of complaints about Japan, which was a big market, not a centrally planned economy, but the role of the state was important in Japan. But Japan, over time, changed because of its reliance on the US and defense. There was a quid pro quo implicit, and also by joining the OECD. It had to accept a number of goals. Now, China is different because China is both big and centrally planned the moment when it joins the WTO. And there were no, as I explained before, no adjustments in the WTO legislative framework. And this is the issue that people confronted, and they thought there is not much need except for a few paragraphs in the protocol of accession to address head-on in the WTO framework. Now, why didn't they address it? To some extent, there was this idea, and we cite a lot of archival record in the US Congress discussions, that China will change. China will understand the merits from participating, they will realize the gains from participating in international trade. They will have every incentive in the world to become a market economy. Furthermore, there were some people who said even China will first, I mean, serious people in the sense, people in very serious positions in the US government, China will not only become a market economy, but will become a liberal democracy as well, because one leads to the other almost mathematically. And on the other hand, there were some simplistic assertions, say, wait a second, they joined, they had very high duties. We don't have to touch our duties. They will lower our duties, will be exporting even more. At the time, there was a very small deficit that the US was running. It will turn into a surplus. There are also political economic explanations. A number of powerful lobbies in both sides of the Atlantic wanted China to join because they saw that there's a huge market there. And they pushed. They didn't say, okay, we'll keep the WTO as is. We add a couple of sentences about wishful changes in the protocol of accession, and let's leave it at that. The issue will take care of itself as the years pass by. Then comes the 2008 financial crisis, which China addresses with its socialist market economy better than the rest of the world. So people in China also start saying, why on earth should they change? Look at those guys, how they ended up. And of course, President Xi, who proceeds in a series of changes. SASAC, all state-owned enterprises come under one powerful bureaucracy now, and so on, rolls back some of the changes that Deng had introduced, and we are where we are. So, in a nutshell, China was a different proposition because it was both big and statist, and we thought, for whatever it's worth at the time, the West, that the issue will take care of itself without rethinking the WTO framework, and that's why we are where we are. André.
No, nothing to add at this stage. I think also in the rest of time.
If nothing to add here, I will be very brief about what can be done now, and I will essentially discuss here, in the interest of time, if you don't mind, Bart, just our proposal, and I will explain briefly why we disagree, actually why we wrote the book, because if we had seen the solutions, we wouldn't have written the book. André and me could do other things. There are three, essentially, proposals. Do nothing, take justice into your own hands, and litigate intelligently. And we disagree with all three. That's why we wrote the book. I'll go through the three very quickly. Do nothing means the problem will remain forever. And actually, this is where we are now. We did nothing, and we continue having problems with China. The WTO has stalled. It's not just bilateral. There is negative spillover for the WTO. The WTO has stalled. Take justice into your own hands. There are very nice papers who paid for Trump's tariffs, actually, who had to incur the cost. And even when there was an agreement and some people celebrated, some criticized China for not delivering. And in our view, those who are right are people like Gary Hafbauer, who say, be careful here. It's a good thing that China did not implement, because had it implemented, we would find ourselves before the WTO accused for managed trade. Counterproductive. Use non-violation complaints. This is, I mean, in principle, it makes sense, but use non-violation complaints. Do not underestimate that these are very difficult complaints to win. But even if you win, this is not the point. Let's assume you win. China doesn't have to change one bit. All China has to do is it can either compensate or change. Well, it takes a little bit of money. There is a lot of slack from its trade service. Here it is. How many non-violation complaints will you do? And I don't see any future here. We believe that if we want to advance this discussion, we need to introduce new disciplines. We cannot address China through litigation. And I leave it for later to discuss litigation in the WTO. I'll say just one thing for now. It's been erratic. I mean, it's hard to reconcile the appellate body case law on public bodies, very hard. Or to reconcile the case law on state trading enterprises with a negotiating intent. Now, we need the clarification of the disciplines on the state-owned enterprises. They're not even mentioned in the agreement on subsidies. And there is a paradox here. I mean, this agreement is negotiated in '93 for all practical purposes. That is 7 years after the China group started negotiating, and even the term is missing, state-owned enterprises. We think there is no need to reinvent the wheel. Both the European Union and the US have signed agreements to address SOEs in more meaningful manner. There is a lot to learn from those agreements. Monitoring has to be enhanced. transparency here is key. Brandeis is a very famous Supreme Court justice in the US, used to say that transparency is the best disinfectant. We need transparency here. Is China willing to play ball? Well, that's what learned people like Bob Zelig would like to see. Pragmatic, if we want to be pragmatic, China has not responded so far. Yes, I mean, it seems that it wants to play a little bit of ball by asking to join the TPP, which has enhanced disciplines on state-owned enterprises and on transfer of technology. But that's about it. Participates in some discussions on joint state initiatives. China is playing a wait-and-see game. Difficult to say if it wants to play ball or not, but what is the counterfactual here? I mean, what should we do? Should we negotiate with China, or should we go and do another soaped up, take our marbles and do a WTO 2.0? We do not like the idea of WTO 2.0. We'd like to find the solution through legislative changes, even though we understand they're not panacea. For reasons I will explain when we move into this discussion. But for now, I pass the floor to André.
I think, to my mind, I think the important element is that indeed, and I think we emphasize that quite a bit in the book, is that although yes, at the WTO, it has been difficult to make progress, and we are still, frankly, a little unclear, even in the book and in all of our investigation, as to why, to begin with, during the Uruguay round, and after all, the Uruguay round was concluded, only 5-6 years before China entered into the WTO, and China had been negotiating its entry into the GATT at the time of the Uruguay round. We are still a bit at a loss as to why the membership, and in particular the EU and the US, did not have foresight, why they did not take advantage of the Uruguay round and not having yet China on board to make some of the reforms that clearly an economy and an economic system like China would require. Yes, I think one can have an explanation, and I think and Petros dwelled quite a bit on that. The fact that sort of the linearity of or the end of history, that we had reached the point of end of history, and there was no need, right? We were all converging to the same economic or perhaps even political system. It was just a matter of time before China would see the light and adopt our economic and political system. So that's one explanation, but I think there are other potential explanations. But so not much has happened in the WTO about quote unquote the China problem or the statism. That does not mean that indeed nothing has happened outside of the WTO. So there is indeed the TPP that we discussed quite a bit, and CPTPP. There is also what has happened on the EU side. One that we discussed in the book, one which we do not, because it was concluded, just as the book was being printed. What was already there is EU-Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is not unlike China, except that it is not as big. That's clearly a huge difference. But in terms of the economic and even maybe political system, I think fairly similar to China. And the EU-Vietnam free trade agreement does contain, like TPP and CPTPP, sort of interesting language that potentially could be extended to China in the context of the WTO. And the other, obviously, that we do not discuss in the book is the EU-China investment agreement, the CAI agreement, signed in December 2019 or 2020, I can't remember now, and but which has certainly not been ratified. But it showed that it's possible to engage with China on some of those issues. It's not just that one can engage with Vietnam, one can engage with China. So, you know, not much progress, but not completely excluded that progress can be made.
Now, the last minute of our discussion is, are we headed in the right direction? I mean, to say all of this, of course, we buy into all of this. On the other hand, there are a couple of reasons why we're a little bit skeptical. One, no historical precedent of multi-agent leadership. We haven't seen anywhere in history, especially divergent leaders like China and the US come up to an agreement. We don't see the US taking the play the leadership role that it should be playing. It's playing a wait and see game also with China. There are a number of, I'm not, don't want to be unfair here, from small initiatives like Chip 4 for semiconductors with Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, to trade in friend shoring and so on, but no direct discussion with China. And one thing which is very important is geopolitics has entered international trade discourse big time again. I mean, we're not in the end of history anymore. We are in a different phase. The China and West issues, they run much deeper than international trade. A number of things need to be done. We have to rethink the national security clause, for example, in how it should be drafted. What is national security? How is an emergency? It's remarkable that we managed to avoid so far litigation concerning export controls, but all of these things are coming back big time. And the bigger questions will have to be addressed. I don't think WTO is the forum. I mean, have to be addressed elsewhere, because trade policy, after all, is foreign policy, and has become even more foreign policy in today's world. And I will stop here, Bart, to leave time for conversation.
Thank you very much for a very clear and interesting presentation. And if I may say, I particularly like the way in which the two co-authors, Petros and André, how you interact with one another on each of those topics. That makes it a very, very interesting presentation. There are a number of questions coming in. Maybe the first one is a question about, we've been focusing on the WTO, on China, on a number of players, the European Union, Japan, the United States, of course. But if you look at the WTO, the last, let's say, decades, you could see that a significantly important player is India, specifically in terms of making it difficult to reach a range of agreements. Could you elaborate a little bit on this? Is there a potential to draw India in a kind of a coalition, either for China? China likes to present itself as kind of a representative of the developing world in the WTO, or for the United States and the European Union. So that's the first question that I would like to raise, and then I will continue with the number of others.
André, alsjeblieft.
So I think that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting question. I mean, the role of India in the GATT, in the WTO, has been very different, obviously, from the role of China. Remember that China, like India, was a founding member of the GATT, and then essentially China withdrew after the change of political regime, after it became communist. No, India was always a GATT member and is a founding WTO member, a founding GATT member, but it was, in a sense, on the margin of the system. It was not as much a closed economy as China had been, but it was fairly autarkic until 1991, right? Until the reform. Essentially, at the time when sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had a heavy cost economic cost on India. And then there was a crisis, an economic crisis in India, and then there were a number of economic reform. But I think it's fair to say, and I still see that, to this day, India has remained, and when you look at the debate within India, very divided as to its position of international trade. It has not embraced trade liberalization and trade as an engine of growth the way China did. I mean, remember that China wanted to enter the WTO not only not to be subject to some of the anti-dumping measures or non-market economy treatment by the United States and the European Union. It also wanted to anchor its economic reform. That was the Deng Xiaoping view, and it was very successful, right? China has become the world #1 exporter of goods. So China enters the WTO and booms in terms of trade, and trade is really an engine of growth. That discussion is still there in India. Is India ready to do that? I participate often in webinar on India and with Indians. They are discussing this at this very time. They're even saying that maybe there is an opportunity now that China is being clobbered partly by other WTO members. That there is an open. There is space for India to embrace trade more fully, and others still of the sense of the old view that the internal market is sufficient and we need to protect industry. So yes, India had the view. I think that mantle was taken over essentially by China, that India was a leader among developing countries, and I think it has lost that the luster there because it was taken over by China as a model of development. So India is not doing badly, but has not achieved sort of the status of being an example to other developing countries as to a growth model that China did. And so I think it's remaining sort of in between. It's certainly not joining now China to bash some of the Western countries, nor is it joining the Western countries to bash China. It's remaining in between, and we have seen that obviously with the Ukraine resolutions at the United Nations. So India is always there, sort of in between, and everybody wonders exactly like you did. Where is India going? Is it going to go this side or is it going to go this side? And I think one has to conclude from so many years that India is not going one side or the other. It's doing it in its own way, and I think there's an Indian way. I think that's very, very clear.
Okay.
Maybe, Bart, if I can add one thing here, very short,
course.
very brief,
Of course.
super brief. I think a lot will depend on the EU-India FTA, which has been revived. I would like to know what's being discussed behind closed doors, but I assume the European Union will use the FTA maybe in concert with the US as a card pull India in this, to pull India into the camp of the Western world. I'm not taking away not one comma from what my dear friend André said.
No.
You have to know one thing. One of the many things we share is we're both married to Indian wives, so we have a particular affinity to discuss with India and would like to discuss India. But I think the FTA might be the game changer.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting answer. Both answers were extremely interesting. And I think that maybe it fits up to a certain extent in the next two questions. But let me first tell you that in terms of the Q&A coming in, I can read here how happy the participants are with your presentations. I'm quoting from one: thanks to both professors for their excellent presentation, and I share that gratitude, and a superb book underlying it. So very nice to hear that, I would say, and I'm happy to read it. But the possible questions that come out of it is the following, and it fits maybe a little bit in what has just been said. And I quote, you mentioned much can be learned on state-owned enterprises from other agreements such as the USMCA and the EU-Vietnam agreement. Can you expand a bit more on what can be learned and what could be the implications for the WTO? How likely is it that China will accept what is currently included on state-owned enterprises in, for instance, the USMCA?
So maybe I answer partly, and I will answer from, I think Petros will know better than me from the US.
Great.
Maybe I can answer from a European side, because I think both dimensions are useful. I think we in Europe, we are a little closer. We are still far apart. As I said, we are a social market economy. We are not a socialist market economy in Europe. So we are clearly, in a sense, much closer to the US type of economy. But we are economies in the EU, the different member states, where state-owned enterprises are very present.
Yeah.
I don't see many state-owned enterprises in the US. There are some, but it's completely marginal. In Europe, it's not always that marginal. And so in a sense, for us in Europe to have a discussion with the Chinese on state-owned enterprises, we can have some common grounds. And that's why I made the reference to the CAI, to the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment between the EU and China, which was a very long discussion, not easy, but in a sense, what was there is that we were asking the Chinese to do certain things, and the Chinese were asking us to do certain things. They could be a quid pro quo. And also that some view that one of the reasons why one did not make progress during the Uruguay round on subsidies and on state-owned enterprise, in a sense, is because the EU was reluctant to do that, right? It felt that it would be constrained. Now we probably regret that, not having changed some of the rules during the Uruguay round, but I think we were sort of dragging our feet a bit because of our own state-owned enterprises. So in that sense, China is state-owned enterprises. We have state-owned enterprise. Again, we are different kind of economies. There's no doubt about that. But still, some things that we have is resonant to what the Chinese have, and then many other countries like Vietnam and have state-owned enterprises. So I think this is, the opening is that it's not that we're in a world where there are state-owned enterprises in China and there is no state-owned enterprises nowhere else in the world. Yeah. The question of state-owned enterprises, even though obviously it has come most to the fore in relationship to China, is something that is relevant to many of the WTO members. And again, I think that allows probably to have a discussion at the WTO that China would have to agree, but that need not to be pointing the finger at China or China only. And I think that is potentially, provided obviously there is the political will, and that's a big if there is the political will to still give some salience to the WTO, or the geopolitics of today does not allow any more cooperation at the global level. So that's a big if. If there is political will to do still some cooperation, because the China will keep its state-owned enterprises, and we have to live with each other in this world, then I think there are openings there. But I think Petros would be knowing much more than me about the USMCA and how it may be relevant, this story.
Much more, I doubt it. Much more than you, I know only about cooking, an area where you have never expressed an interest in developing your talents. But André described the thing extremely well. The context, I will move into practicalities. I mean, the big difference that we see, the big difference is, even in Europe, which is state-owned enterprises, it's a larger percentage of the economy than in the US. SOEs are subjected to antitrust enforcement. I mean, in the European Union, you can have them. If in a way, you can qualify even Lufthansa as an SOE. But can Lufthansa go ahead and say, I will monopolize all the routes between Frankfurt and Munich? No. Between Brussels and Munich? No. There is antitrust enforcement, and that's what is missing in China. Every account I have seen concerning the quality of antitrust enforcement in China, essentially they say this is it's a regulatory subsidy in favor of the Chinese companies. That's one big difference. Now, of course, there is nothing like world competition law, and that's the problem. We killed the Genie group in 5 seconds, and I have to accept my responsibility here. I was not a big fan. I've totally changed my mind ever since because I didn't link it to the China issue. We dropped the trade and competition discussion in Cancun, and look at where we are now. There is nothing. The only way we can do it is through FTAs. Now, on the likelihood part, sorry, just one small point here, and there are some additional of smaller, let's say, improvements possible. For example, why can't we introduce a rule which says that if ownership is 75 and above or 50, whatever the percentage, we can find it, state ownership, there should be a presumption that this is a public body. A presumption at least, as it happens in a number of legal orders. Now, what is the likelihood? China asked the rest of the TPP for permission to become a member. Now, TPP has much stronger disciplines on SOEs than the WTO, which does not know the term SOE. So China believes it can play some ball in this game. And that's why I like very much what André said before. I mean, we should not give up on China simply because we don't like some of the regime choice. There is a potential for discussion. Now, I don't know if China was genuine or not genuine. This maybe we'll never know, but I do know that China officially requested accession to TPP, a regime that we agree along with the EU-Vietnam FTA is one of the best regulatory examples we know to tackle state-owned enterprises.
Can I add something? There's a question here, not adding, but adding a question to the answers that have been given here. And that is, what is the position of China with respect to the status quo? And that's a question that has been raised here. Is it serious to expect that China would really be prepared to negotiate a number of new commitments, like, for instance, on the question of technology transfers or eventually on state-owned enterprises, given that maybe it has a significant interest in the maintenance of the status quo? Of course, Petros, what you just said about TPP may partly contradict this, or maybe an indication that maybe China's interest in the status quo is not that large that maybe we assume. But anyhow, what would be your answer to this? The interest of China in the status quo, and therefore the extent to which we really can expect China to accept deals that eventually would change the situation.
Yolanda, you want to start first?
I'm happy to. I mean, a question is whether the status quo is feasible.
Okay.
You know, the world is changing, and in a sense, and I think we spend a lot of time and pages on the book comparing, as Petros very well explained, China and Japan. You know, yeah. We spent hours and hours, Petros and I discussed between ourselves before writing it, what is similar and what is different between China and Japan vis-a-vis the WTO or the rules-based system and vis-a-vis the United States. Because both of us, we remember very well that some of the language in the trade area that is being used mostly in the US vis-a-vis China is very, very reminiscent of the language that was used towards Japan at the height of Japan's threat towards the United States in terms of competitiveness. But I think the big difference, I think Petros explained that very well, is that Japan had a different geopolitical relationship to the United States that China does. Japan as US troops depends on US defense. China is not in that situation. So Japan was an economic rival, certainly to the United States at some stage. And there were bilateral deals between the US and Japan, not unlike the phase one between the US and China. But China, in addition to be an economic rival, is a geopolitical rival. Okay? And so that situation puts into question really what is the future relationship, not only between China and the United States, but we have not had, imagine in a sense, the Cold War, right? Go back to the Cold War, having China and the Soviet Union inside the GATT. That would have been very, very complicated. So if the world is going towards some kind of a confrontation, not necessarily military confrontation, but political confrontation, more and more with China, this is going to be very, very complicated. So one issue is, what kind of relationship do we want? So I don't think that the status quo is necessarily feasible, both economically and politically. There are talks, you hear that in Brussels, but you hear that in Washington, that this is the last chance that either we do reform and China agrees to do some of those reforms. Otherwise, we pull the plug basically on the WTO. And you can look at the US having pulled the plug on the dispute settlement as sort of a warning shot. We are not willing anymore to have a system which favors, that's the way some in the US view, the system favors China. So as you said, China is not unhappy with the status quo, but the United States certainly, and partly the European Union, may not be willing to go along this status quo. And one element is the dispute settlement. Another one is that maybe one day, Petros spoke of a WTO 2.0. That would be the old members of the WTO recreating among themselves without China, maybe without Russia, sort of a new forum. So China is to also wonder about that, whether the status quo is livable is it sustainable or not? No, we don't know. I mean, they don't know, we don't know. This is a complicated game. So at some stage, just what, no doubt, and I think that's the way Petros concluded very rightly, that we're in a geopolitical world now. And now I think it has come the time to decide what is it we want of this world. Do we still want cooperation? If we want cooperation, we need, in a sense, to have a new deal, but hopefully within the WTO that we know, but some changes there with China, the US, the EU, and the other members still within the WTO, but accepting that, we have to make some changes, they have to make some changes. But the status quo is probably not feasible. So the status quo would be the slow death of the WTO. I think that's the more likely.
Okay. Petros, did you want to add something?
Nee, twee zaken, enkel twee zaken. Just two things, very, very short things. The first is, there is a willingness by China to play ball. I think they participate in all joint statement initiatives in the WTO. It is quite clear they understand exactly what André suggested, that the status quo is elusive. President Trump essentially said, I take my marbles and I go home if you continue like this. Well, if they take their marbles and go home, can you imagine WTO without the US? And what if Europe follows? But I'll give you one very recent case which made me rethink a number of things. In the US, there was a decision to allow dissemination of low technology in standard setting institutions, even if you have companies like Huawei participating, because the US also has realized that they cannot take their marbles and go home 100%, because they will lose the standardization game. And they lose standardization game. This is a decision by the Bureau of Industry and Security of the Department of Commerce a few days ago. They cannot. Everybody has a stake at this game. And this is what we try to say in this book, that the overarching idea has to be that this, if we accept the proposition, you cannot walk away from globalization, even if you redesign global value chains, whatever, Well, we need something to carry the globalization, and this something has to be multilateral. You cannot have a globalization economic and then three people deciding on the regime. And the big players, they have to be there. And that's what is driving, if you will, that's the spirit of our book.
Okay, there is an additional question that maybe fits into the answers that you just gave. There are a number of players that really matter here. What about the transatlantic cooperation as a driver of necessary change, or as a way to, let's say, attract China back to the table? Is there a potential in that relationship?
Well, I think yes. I mean, what we have, this transatlantic now trade and technology council, which is clearly very geopolitical, right? It's at the interface between geopolitics and economics. When you look at including technology, that's why it's trade and technology, and technology is very much at the heart of the issues here. The geopolitical issues, and although China is never mentioned, it's clear that it is a forum. I won't say an anti-China forum, but it's a forum indeed of convergence of views between the United States and the European Union that de facto is sending a message to China. So we are definitely not anymore in the TTIP kind of game that we had during Obama's presidency. I mean, that was by Trump. Biden has no interest in reviving that, and anyway, I think it's very, very complicated. But in a sense, it has moved from a discussion which is a trade discussion and a bilateral free trade agreement to a bilateral discussion which is partly trade, partly technology, partly geopolitics. So it's geoeconomics, geopolitics, and I'm sure that the message is received in China and having an impact. So yes, I do think that this discussion is, I don't know whether it's a game changer, but it's an element into movement, potential movement on the part, both on our part, feeling that united with the United States, having closer common view, we are better equipped to discuss with China, and China understanding that there's probably not going to be, even though we have each of our interest on the two sides of Atlantic, we still have lots of common interest among us.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And maybe a last question, because time, I was going to say is running out, but that's a very dramatic kind of statement to make. Unless Petros, you want to add something to?
No, let's go. We have no time.
Okay.
Continue. Yeah.
No, I don't. Okay. Anyhow.
De laatste vraag, hè?
The last question. Even if you can fill the gaps, I'm quoting now, in the WTO legislative framework, China lacks transparency. Therefore, other nations cannot gather the required evidence against China. Also, China prefers bilateral talks over multilateral talks. How can one force China to be more transparent if this conflicts with its internal political system? This is a question basically that focuses on the internal characteristics of the Chinese system. The claim that is being made, transparency is an issue here and seems to be endemic to that system. What to make of this?
Yes.
You see, there are, very briefly, I'm not saying that the WTO system is a guarantee for absolute transparency, and of course, no one has an incentive to disseminate self-incriminating information. That much is clear. But there is a lot already in terms of transparency in the WTO. You have cross notifications when you can get information. When the US was upset with China's lack of notification of subsidies, it went to the subsidies committee in the WTO and notified 120 schemes. Obviously, they have their way to find out. Now, I agree that the problem we have in the WTO is the common agent, the Secretariat, does not have enough power to go detect and disseminate. And this is something that needs to be addressed eventually. But it's not that China is totally non-transparent. It is not as transparent as Europe. But if you ask the US, they say Europe is not as transparent as we are. We have Freedom of Information Act, you don't, and so on and so forth. There are shades of transparency. We have some, and we can improve it. But it's not that we don't know. I mean, how on earth do we have all those disputes against China if we didn't have information? I mean, we should not be nihilists, I think.
Okay. André, you want to add something?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Well, that leaves.
Petros.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to conclude this webinar. I really want to thank you both for a very interesting presentation. I already alluded to that, not just because of the peculiar way you did it, this interaction between the two co-authors over different parts of your presentation. It's really, I like that very much. I already quoted also from the compliments that came from the audience, and I share these compliments full-heartedly. Thank you very much for being among us. Of course, also thank you to the organizers of this event, and thank you for the many questions that came from the audience. A good evening or a good afternoon or whatever stage in the day you currently are. Bye-bye.
Tot volgende keer, Bart.
Tot volgende keer.
Volgende keer.
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Bedankt.
Thanks to everyone. Bye. Bye, Bart, and bye, Kerry, Axel. Bye, everyone.
Harry Otterburn for
And
organizing.
bye, Petros. Bye.
Tot kijk.
Bye.